I wish to make a complaint.
Sorry, we're closing for lunch.
Never mind that, my lad. I wish to complain about this parrot what I purchased not half an hour ago from this very boutique.
Oh, yes, the Norwegian blue. What's wrong with it?
I'll tell you what's wrong with it. It's dead. That's what's wrong with it.
Well, right. Well, bring it up. I mean, Spencer Leonard, this is the Parrot Room now. You're talking only to the patrons, and I'm glad to get a chance to do the second half with you. As is normal these days, my head is going in 1,000 different directions, and because we're recording on a different day, what I want to talk about is maybe a little different than what we talked about before. But I think we can work it out so that we're going to cover a lot of ground. But before we start recording, I brought up to you something that actually Derek Varn had brought up to me, which is that the membership of the DSA is declining. That what looked like a massive growth in membership for the DSA like 6 months ago or a year ago is now being shown to be, it was actually the beginning of a decline. And I think they've lost like a quarter of their members or more. And you weren't surprised by this at all. Did you know about this as well, that this is going on?
I guess I don't have numbers on that, but I take it for granted. I mean, I think, obviously it's participating in a wider depoliticization. It's sometimes, I guess at some level it's obvious to people, and at another level, they're not really registering, or only perhaps now registering, that we have, for better or for worse, we're putting the crisis in the rearview mirror now. What's been happening, obviously at an economic level, there's been the Great Recession. And Obama was a kind of caretaker, late neoliberal president who was elected to address the crisis and could not, did not, would not. And in that sense, his presidency was a failure by capitalist political standards. And those energies and that disappointment went into the Bernie campaign, which, I guess one of the most fundamental failures of which was to identify the fact that Obama's presidency was a failure. The very fact that Bernie could never criticize Obama, I thought was a fundamental problem. And it was a fundamental problem for the young people who were joining the DSA and thereby joining the Democrats. And, because the strategy was, a kind of a rehash of the old reorientation strategy, which had failed in the 60s and was bound to fail now. So, yeah, I'm not surprised. I think, to tie it to what we were talking about before, the subject we were discussing was imperialism, and and hoarier still, Marxist views on that. And it really wasn't a part, or I guess you could say it's a question that divides the older millennials from the younger ones. Because the anti-war movement was, I guess at one level, anti-imperialist, but from the first, that was a problem for them. And, the question of, solidarity with the Kurds, or, the problem of the Iraqi Communist Party, pointing out that they didn't support, military opposition to the American occupation. There were these unmistakable, the search to find, who is the victim of imperialism in Syria. Anti-imperialism never quite worked for the millennial left, and of course it was completely absorbed into the Obama campaign. And from the time of Occupy through the Bernie campaign, the question of our geopolitics has, really, obviously today we're living in the midst of this, seeming saber rattling, possible buildup to war in the Ukraine. And the left has nothing to say about this.
Yeah, this is something that I want to bring this up. I mean,
Trump really took the wind out of their sails in general, because Trump was the peace president.
Well, I mean, in a sense, he was. Yeah, I mean, he did do some extrajudicial killing and some major bombing, and I think he increased the drone policies of Obama. I think there was even more drone attacks under Trump.
But he was much more vocal than Obama ever was. He voiced the war weariness of the U.S. and especially of the U.S. military. When he would say things like, the military loves me, by which I mean the soldiers, not the officers, right? And the strong support that he had amongst enlisted men. He was, what was his phrase? Endless wars. I think
that was Dick Cheney's phrase. Dick Cheney was like, we're going to have the war on terror will not end in our lifetimes. No one alive today will see the end of the war on terror.
Right.
And so
that was really fundamental to Trump, defeating Jeb Bush.
Yeah. No, for sure.
Hanging that on his neck. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah. So, so I'm interested to know how anti-imperialism. Well, actually, I'm not going to get distracted by that. I'm going to ask you about the Ukraine. But my feeling about what's happening in the Ukraine is that no matter what happens, whether Russia invades or not, and I don't know, has Russia invaded yet? But whether Russia invades or not, the U.S. is not going to be sending ground troops to defend the Ukraine. We're not going to be escalating into a war in that region. That's just my sense of it, the situation. And it seems to me that the best, thinking for like a politician, the best thing for them to do would be to negotiate with Putin and say, yeah, look, we're not going to invite the Ukraine into NATO. You don't have to worry about that. You don't have to invade. And see if they can broker some sort of deal, but that to me seems like the obvious thing to do. And I don't know if that's a left position, but it's maybe a sensible position. Why do you think the left overall doesn't have much to say about what's happening there and is confused as to how to respond to the saber rattling and the potential violence that might erupt? Am I being too blasé, by the way, about this?
No. Well, I mean, obviously, we live in a world in which, an irresponsible ruling class can, wreak terrible destruction, really without willing to do it, just by sheer blundering and incompetence. And, that's a real problem. I mean, the incompetence.
I haven't seen that in my lifetime. I have never seen the U.S. go to war without choosing to go to war, a war against its own will. But I know that in history,
I definitely think that, I definitely think that there is less appetite for war in this country right now, and it has to do with the fact, of the unresolved political crisis. Obviously, the way that the mainstream media will talk about that is that the country's divided. I think that there is a broad cynicism and depoliticization. To get back to the decline of the DSA. I mean, these are dark times. And I think, Putin's exploiting that. I also think that, any student of history knows that, the sphere of influence of Russia has been rolled back, more than has been the case since Catherine the Great. I mean, the Tsar had, of course, immense influence, even beyond what the Soviet Union had, at its height. Well, maybe not at its height, but, had immense influence in regions that were later incorporated into the Soviet Union and beyond. And, now, NATO's talking about expanding into territory that, has been under the control or hegemony of Russia for the entirety of the modern age. And I think that there was a certain amount of blundering involved with that, but I think the real question is, why the exhaustion, the sense of, I think this administration is, incapable of going to war. I think it's incapable of doing anything significant domestically. I think there's a sense of decline. He, the geriatric, character of the head of state is a kind of emblem. And, I don't think that captures, the real situation. I don't think that, the American empire is as unmistakably in decline as, obviously the left, I think, cheers inter-imperialist rivalry or just simply geopolitical rivalry. It's not really clear why even, what the language of imperialism even gets us anymore. But I don't think that, I don't think that that's belief. I don't think even they believe their own bullshit. I don't think that people really think that, first of all, I don't think that anybody's going to start, going to China. I don't think people are going to be immigrating to China or anywhere else. In general, the United States not only has, a great deal of economic power, it continues to have a great deal of, if you will, legitimacy in the world. And a lot of anti-Americanism is really right wing and has been for a while. So I don't know what there is to say except, of course we all pray for peace because it's not going to, I don't see any leftist upside to this war at all.
Where do you think that anti-Americanism comes from? Is it kind of an echo of the time where
this gets back to the real issue, right, of what we were discussing before, right, which is that Stalinism substituted decolonization for revolution, right? They, obviously there was a, even Lenin endorsed a kind of reorientation towards the East after the defeat of the revolution in Germany in 1919, and hopes for India, for China, were a part of the Comintern, the early Comintern, and that wasn't an attempt to substitute decolonization or colonial national self-determination projects for the revolution. It was part of a strategy of retreat, and self-consciously so. But the left in the 20th century, took decolonization to be the way of affirming the course of history. Right. So, to be able to tell people that, decolonization takes place in the context of a long, the 20th century, regression and counter-revolution is very jarring for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But obviously, when the anti-Vietnam struggle was the way I would argue, the most salient and obvious way that the new left distracted itself, buried its head in the sand as regards the fundamental tasks of building a left in the core of capitalism, right?
Mhm.
That solidarity with the third world substituted for a much more difficult project, which would have completely revolutionized geopolitics. Obviously, if there had been a rebirth of a socialist left in,
Mhm.
West Germany, France, the Netherlands, Britain, and the United States and Canada, that would have reconfigured the entire face of the world,
Right.
in a way that we don't even know if the Vietnamese won or lost. Like, did the
Right.
left win in Vietnam?
No, I don't think
Right.
so.
So,
But but on the other hand, in Europe, in a large part of the
so
world,
let me just finish my.
uh,
Let me just be sure that I answer the question. So,
okay.
the question is: did America defeat communist revolution? Did American imperialism defeat communist revolution? Is the American empire the enemy of the left? I would argue no. Right? I would argue that the left was most fundamentally defeated in Europe in the wake of World War One.
Mm.
And, in some sense, politically, the most egregious thing that the US ever did was its support for white armies
Mm.
in Russia.
Mhm.
Other than that, it just pieced together global society in the wake of its collapse and ruin. Did the left destroy the international revolution? No.
Mhm.
Unless you believe that, you know, unless you believe Maoist bullshit, in which case, the 20th century is a great revolutionary century. That's that but for the counter-revolutionary role of the United States, has seen the victorious people's struggles,
Mhm.
victorious, triumphant or everywhere. I think
Mhm.
that's where the anti-Americanism comes from. Right? The anti-Americanism comes from the rotten left.
Yeah.
And the real question is, didn't the United States create the context for the reconstitution of the left in Europe by
Mhm.
creating the conditions for the reconstitution of society?
Mhm. Well,
Um,
I mean, this gets to the question of the Soviet Union. I think because I think in the 50s and 60s and 70s, even if you were on the left, you might be on the side of the Soviet Union, uh, as
sure,
against the United States.
sure.
Certainly in the 50s, that would have been the case. Um, and I recall that when the atom bomb was, created, it was leftist spies from the Soviet Union who made sure that the Soviet Union kept pace with the development of the atom bomb. And the reason why was because the United States was conceived of as being a threat to socialism, not just to the Soviet Union, and a threat to the world as such, and that keeping a check on the U.S. power was beneficial to the development of a socialist struggle, maybe alongside of the Soviet Union's struggle, maybe in opposition to it. But everyone, whether or not they were tankies or not, whether they were Bolsheviks or anti-Bolsheviks, would have agreed that checking American power was vitally important for the left at that time.
I mean,
So,
I guess I would simply say that there really aren't two sides, in the post-war world.
mhm,
The United States is overwhelmingly more powerful than
mhm,
the East ever was.
mhm,
Um, the question, people had to ask themselves, certainly, if you were a worker, where do you want to live?
mm,
you know,
That was an easy answer.
there's
You
an
would
easy answer
rather,
to that one, right? So
yeah, the United States for
you want to live
sure.
in the United States, right? What's the worker state in the world in 1955? It's the United States.
Mhm.
So, you know, obviously, I'm not interested in endorsing Cold War anti-communism.
Mhm.
I would simply say that, you know, rather than looking at communism as a question of geography,
Mhm.
I certainly think that all discussion of communist countries
Mhm.
is a mistake.
Mhm.
You know, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc are a part of a U.S. dominated global imperialist state. Ultimately, there's a global Bonapartist state.
Mhm.
There's a global capitalist order of which so-called communism is a part.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
you know, in other words, the issue isn't geography; it's history, right?
Mhm.
What the issue isn't, you know, the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. The issue is 1950. You know, what is the world in 1950? You know, the U.S. is not averse to socialism. It's a revolutionary country. It's
Mhm.
built on you know, multiple revolutions, and
Mhm.
socialism is a part of that history. But you know, in the U.S. as in Russia, the socialist revolution lost its way. The socialist revolution was defeated. The socialist revolution ultimately came up against obstacles that it could not address, and those obstacles were not exterior, right?
Right.
They were of its own making. They didn't know how to move forward anymore. And the issue with communism is that it made that condition, that impasse, obscure by declaring victory, right? That
Yeah.
there wasn't a crisis in the international left. There was the unfolding of communism worldwide
Mhm.
under Comrade Stalin, under
Mhm.
Comrade Mao. You know, the question is, you know, do you want to be on the right side of history or
Mhm.
in the dustbin, right? These are all, you know, the crime ideologically was to treat defeat as victory. And
Mhm.
that defeat was not at the hands of the United States.
Yeah, that
That,
happens a
that's
lot on the left, that we treat defeat as a victory. You said that
Well, that's the
uh
heart of Stalinism. That's the
yeah,
heart of Stalinism. It's not, you know, that they, you know, don't allow opposition press. It's not like any particular illiberal. It's not the stop. You know, it's not the state police.
mhm,
You know, none of
right.
those things are what make Stalinism Stalinism, right? What makes Stalinism Stalinism is to say the state police and the illiberalism and the criminalization of opposition
Mhm.
and the consolidation of socialism in one country are what the revolution looks like,
Yeah, right, right.
right? That this is the revolution. That's the crime.
Yeah. Earlier, you said that the millennial left, when they were facing coming through the anti-war movement, saw anti-imperialism as a problem. Did they see anti-imperialism as a problem for the reasons that we just laid out? That that they understand that a struggle for socialism was something different from the struggle from decolonization. Do they
I think
have
that,
this
I think that
perspective?
they I think that they saw the question of anti-imperialism, which is to say, the violence and inequality enforced through the agencies of the global state, the fact that war is endemic to global capitalism.
Mhm.
Um, I think that they experienced that as the intergenerational transmission of the left, right? So where the anti-imperialism came from was from the old new leftists, right? This was their last hurrah.
Mhm.
That, and they had, in a sense, they had done this to our generation, right? With Nicaragua solidarity, they had rehashed, anti-imperialism. They had rehashed the anti-Vietnam War opposition with solidarity with the Sandinistas, and
Right.
and they were doing that again
Mhm.
In the 2000s. And I think that the opportunity was there for the millennials, right? So that anti-imperialism, of course, is not anything to disagree with,
Mhm.
right? It's just the way, I mean, there are obviously a lot of dimensions to this, but it was a way in which the defeated character of the new left was visible.
Right.
That women's emancipation, that the overcoming of racism was all that these were also expressions of the defeat of the new left, right? I mean, the new left, of course, is going to tell us that they ended the war in Vietnam, they overcame racism, and they overcame patriarchy, right?
Well, no. Well, I mean,
And the question is, how do you begin to understand that that all of that is a way of masking the fact that the new left didn't build a new left?
right.
Right? It's not that anyone's opposed to ending the war in Vietnam or overcoming Jim Crow or overcoming patriarchy, but these are ways of affirming the course of history, affirming the capitalist order, and of course, affirming the Democratic Party, right?
Mhm.
Which remarkably for some of these people, and obviously Obama traded on this, is supposedly an anti-war party, right? Kind of insane. But I think that the listening to the 60-year-olds or the 65-year-olds as they were then,
Mhm.
by young millennials, and being attracted to Marxism through it, right? That was really the high watermark, I think, for Marxism for the millennials, was at the beginning,
Mhm.
right? Which was also, the time, of course, of the founding of Platypus.
So you're talking about 2006 or 2007,
Yeah,
around there?
yeah.
Well, okay. A couple of thoughts come to mind, but I want to go back to.
So the question is, so I just want to emphasize that the opportunity for the millennials was to recognize the need to overcome the legacy of the new left. And
Right.
they have failed in that and
Mhm.
have recapitulated the new left. Right.
Right.
They're even like getting Kim Moody out to rehearse the 1970s rank and file strategy, and they want to do every single thing that the new left did.
Right. Right.
It seems to me, they
Well,
got to have a new anti-racist movement, and they've got to have a third wave feminism. Right? They've got to repeat. They got to check all the boxes, and that's the missed opportunity of the millennials. Is at the beginning they could see the possibility of these people aren't telling us everything.
Right. All right. So, in 2002, I was part of the peace movement in Portland. I've talked to Chris
Right.
Crone
Right.
about this, and
Mhm, mhm.
and my memory of the peace movement is very different from Chris Catrone's memory and your memory. And what you're talking about is the later millennial peace movement. There was a millennial element in 2002 as well. Very young kids involved in the peace movement, or not very young, but young to older millennial. I would say upwards of 26, year old people were involved. And at that time, I was like 30, 31, and I was an elder for unless I was an elder of the young, and then there was the boomers who were really in charge of the peace movement in Portland. There was an old institutional new left peace movement already in place,
Right.
even though it was a new organization called Portland Peaceful Response Coalition. It had been put together by a guy who had been working on the left as a peace activist since the 70s or 60s. So right, he was in the background, but at first, and that this is when the peace movement was, when I was first involved, we were like opposing the invasion of Afghanistan, the bombing of Afghanistan, not Iraq, and then we moved to Iraq. At first, it was overcoming the attitude from the public, including a good portion of young people and people who you might think of as being sympathetic to the left or on the left or liberals, overcoming their opposition to the idea of peace, overcoming their opposition to the anti-war position. And the way that was done was to retreat from anti-imperialism, to retreat from politics altogether, and to almost embrace a pacifist line at first. Like, we are for peace, and that's it. We're not going to have political positions. We're not going to talk about what's happening in Afghanistan in any substantial way. We're just simply going to have a very abstract position because the climate won't allow for real political conversation. And that was how it started. And the
I think that, I think that 9/11, raised the question of the growth of Islamism, the fact that the revolution of our time, has been the Iranian Revolution. That's the crisis of the Middle East, certainly flows from, in fundamental ways, the Iranian Revolution. The fact that the U.S. lost its keystone ally in the Middle East, and has to rely on Saudi Arabia, and which is, funds global jihad, and all of that came home to roost at that time. So, of course, I was in graduate school in Chicago, and a student of South Asian history, in a department of South Asian languages and civilizations. They were throwing money at us. People were being recruited out of my department to, ultimately to, become CIA heads of station in Islamabad. So it was all there, and they were recruiting professors to teach Dari and all the languages of Afghanistan. And what I remember, of course, I was on the left and at the time, and what I remember is a kind of a liberal awakening. I remember books like Paul Berman's book at the time. Of course, I remember Christopher Hitchens's Crack Up. People beginning to realize that the politics in Afghanistan certainly was indefensible, right? I think that that's what's driving your pacifism, right?
Right.
Is that, people can't be in solidarity with the Taliban regime.
Right. No, right.
So
we found Rawa to be in solidarity with the Revolutionary Women of Afghanistan, who were opposing the U.S. Bombings, but also opposing the Taliban. They were a radical left organization within Afghanistan for women's emancipation and socialism, who put out a line that eventually became the political stance of PPRC, or at least a section of us, like and the other thing to remember is that this all was coming out of the anti-WTO protests, coming out of what was at that time the most anti-capitalist movement around. So there was a sense of
particularly strong out there in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, particularly strong there. Yeah, and so like, I recalled some of the debates being on the left being like, we can like a writer of some note in the Pacific Northwest was saying we cannot allow ourselves to get diverted into a liberal Democrat peace movement that has no aim to take down capitalism or and has nothing to do with the working class because it makes us feel good morally. We have to continue to strike at the heart of the beast and the World Trade Organization and blah blah blah. But and you know, like
I don't know that that's the heart of the beast, but yeah, I mean,
that was right.
I
Right. Well,
certainly agree with the broad sentiment of
yeah.
yeah. These are distractions. You know, I don't think that the left had anything to do with the course of history
No, obviously
at
not.
all, and you know, I think that I don't think that the left had much to do with the course or anything to do with the course of history in Vietnam. I don't think that the United States was defeated in Vietnam. I
Yeah.
think that
Well, you and Chomsky would agree. Like you and
right. I
Chomsky
agree.
agrees
I
with
think
you.
Chomsky's absolutely right about that. You know, I mean, not that I think he draws the conclusions that I would draw, but I think the United States made it clear that you know we were going to have an orderly decolonization. You know, and one in which you know the United States was you know going to be consulted, and if you wanted to have a disorderly one that was going to involve the killing off of certain classes of people, landlord classes, certain sorts of you know bloody and unpredictable land reform projects, there was going to be a price to be paid for that.
Mm,
You know, I don't think that you know there was ever a question of world revolution at stake in Vietnam,
mm,
uh, and I think that you know with so I think you know in the 2000s the question really was how is this a part of a strategy for socialism, right?
right.
That had become completely threadbare, right? So here you have these old new leftists
Mm,
who have all of their crazy organizations, and those organizations, maybe not in Portland, but nationally, are you know the Not in Our Name coalition, et cetera.
yeah. Answer.
The Answer coalition. They are organizing the anti-war movement, and they are telling young people, you know, that this has something to do with what Lenin and Marx were talking about,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And you know. That was, you know, there was I think, a real learning opportunity there.
Hmm.
You know, to say, well, not really. You know, whatever, you know, we want, you know, pacifist organizations, you know, fine. Like, I'm not against it. You know, it's like in the Ukraine, you know, I don't want to see, I certainly don't want to see, you know, gratuitous, you know, needless death. And I don't want to see the kind of rank politics that might go with it. And I certainly don't want to see, you know, anything remotely like, you know, an escalation to real geopolitical instability.
Right.
You know, that's not good for the left or any possibility of the left or any possibility of education. You know, it crowds out bandwidth.
Uh-huh.
But you know, the question, you know, when you see Verso books translating Osama bin Laden, which they did, you know, you have to ask yourself, what does this have to do with the left? And I'm not saying that Verso was like in favor of Osama bin Laden. Just what the fuck does it have to do? Why does anybody?
Why would Verso be? I mean,
Yeah,
I
why am
think
I wasting 1 minute on this? Right?
I think someone translating the works of Osama bin Laden in English would have been a worthwhile thing to do at that time for his historical record, and so people can
Sure,
access, you know, the facts basically and
of course.
understand what was going on. But for Verso to do so is extremely odd, actually. You know, um and
Well, I mean, you know, and you know, we know that the left was particularly, you know, I mean, I was recently looking at this new, you know, anti-Pastone book in the CPGB, you know, in Britain, you know, Mike McNair writing a preface to it. We know that there was all kinds of lunatic anti-Semitism after 9/11 on the left.
Right.
I heard people say that it was a CIA Mossad project.
Yeah.
It wasn't made up. Of course, they said that.
Right.
These people have serious defenses in ideologically
Mhm.
to facing the fact that we're nowhere.
Have you read the Anti-Pistone book, by the way? Just for the side, have you read that book yet, or is it out?
It's sitting at UVA library waiting for me to pick up.
Okay, I gotta get it. I gotta get a hold of it.
I'd be happy to discuss that.
Yeah,
At another
we
time.
should definitely do that another time. So
You
yeah,
know,
no, you're absolutely right.
I think that, of course, people wanted to ignore the fact that the Saddam Hussein regime, the regime in Kabul, they were indefensible. The people of those countries, by any measure, were seriously discontent. That they were probably convinced, poor things, that the U.S. overthrowing their governments might bring on better times. That was real. Just like Tahrir Square was not really about American imperialism, right? I mean, it was about the local rottenness, and the fact that the U.S. is just a force for stability. Really, it doesn't really care where that comes from. If it comes, if the Islamists won't lob bombs towards New York City, they'll deal with anybody. They'll deal with the Saudis. They'll deal with the Shah. They'll deal with left-wing governments. They'll deal with the Labour Party. They'll deal with socialists in France or in Israel, whatever. Right? This idea that the U.S. is running around, sort of picking winners and losers and always for the right. It's just not true. The rightward drift, just like Stalinism doesn't come from Russia, right? It comes from all over, not least the American left. The rightward drift of global geopolitics doesn't come from the United States. Not without a lot of help.
I have an odd question for you. It's way off the topic in a way, but it's back to the moment. What is it about the way the world is working and the way the U.S. power works, and that makes it difficult or impossible for Russia to be a part of NATO? Why is there conflict on this level between Russia and the United States, or between China and the United States? What is the source of that conflict? It's not ideological. Like you just said, the U.S. will deal with anybody, right? And yet, we would love to deal with China. China wants to deal with us. We don't want to be, neither party wants to be in conflict. And yet, there's this conflict emerging. Why do you think that's happening from a Marxist perspective?
Well, it isn't economic.
It isn't.
No, I mean, not in the sense that there's some, that the reality of politics can be explained with reference to the economy. No, right? That would be. I mean, there's obviously a lot of wised up Marxism in the world, right? That that Marxism plays like armchair geostrategy or something, and I think that in general that's a very rotten impulse, because we need to worry about being able to change the world, and we're in absolutely no position to change the world. Right. And Marxism is no consolation. The fact that it's illuminating something is best considered an illusion. Because Marxism really is nothing. It is really nothing without a programmatic strategy for socialism, right? All that we can say is that because the collapse of world history is bound up with the collapse of Marxism, that a certain kind of understanding of that collapse of Marxism helps us to understand the present, right? Not some rotten, well, historical materialism tells us that really below the superstructural, noise is the base economic reality. That is, nonsense, I would say. The real Marxist account would have to do with the failure of our politics. I completely agree that I think the reality of the global order is that there's every reason for a kind of ultra imperialism where China and Russia and Europe, Japan, South Korea, every major country in the world cooperates, to jointly exploit the global working class. Why not?
Right.
And of course, the money is interfused on all kinds of levels, right? There isn't such a thing as American capital or China, et cetera. That is, that wasn't even the case, of course, in World War One. And so I would say that it's like asking the question of, why can't we legislate anything in the United States? Why can't anyone pass a law about COVID or vaccines? Or pass a law guaranteeing the right of a woman to choose? Right? We can barely pass a law, right? We rely on the Supreme Court to make our laws, right? For
Often
major things like gay marriage, right? You can't even get people to vote, right? There's a deep collapse of our political order, right? Even compared to what we've seen in our own lifetimes, right? And
but what would you make about
that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about a real political collapse, a collapse of political parties, a collapse of even the will to liberalism. I think people obviously don't want to be bothered with their rights. They don't want to be bothered with the responsibility for the course of history. People hate, they think that humanity is a pox on, it is a crime against other species. I think that the rot is at that level, and it does mean that, this hasn't been responsible for a long time. Look at these lunatics in Pakistan and in India with nuclear weapons.
Right.
Some Hindutva lunatic, Modi, and some former cricket player in Pakistan. We don't have a remotely responsible geopolitical order, right? These, the Democrats, for God's sake, are, have the most political power in the world. These people are sunk in mania, right? They think that there's a white supremacist rising, and these people are what they're worrying about are phantoms, and I think that that's where I would begin, is to try to explain the irrationality of the political order, and that, by the way, is what. That's what Marx's concept of Bonapartism is about. That's what the notion of imperialism is about. It's about the democratic self-subjugation of society, right? It's about the erection of a political order to postpone socialism, Right?
Yeah. Okay. I just want to go back to your comment about I'm one of these terrible Marxists that likes to think in terms of base and superstructure. I'm just going to confess this. I know that's
Yeah, I know you
crass.
are.
Yeah, and I don't think that I have a really simple-minded approach to it, but
Sure.
like I'm reading the German ideology, and the division of labor between town and country can be shown to have an influence on the ideologies of town and country, and not only that, but and the trajectory that the of capitalist development, right? The contradiction between town and country, which is a material contradiction, is a economic contradiction on that level. Also determined the material and political trajectory of bourgeois society and capitalism, according to the German ideology. So I feel like it's worthwhile to ask the question, like, what is the material basis of the division between the Russia and the United States, or China and the United States? What is, uh, and how is that expressed politically, and how does that political expression change the material basis and change the material reality? Because all those things are going on. But I mean, there was a moment after 1991, maybe a few years after, where it didn't seem ridiculous that Russia would join NATO. Not at least not to Russians, and I don't think even in the United States to a lot of people it didn't seem ridiculous. It would have been a way to conclude the Cold War, with by establishing some sort of peace and really closing the door on the Cold War. And there wasn't. Well, I mean, the people in
I
Russia
mean,
were suffering greatly.
there was Fukuyama, right? I mean, there he
Yeah,
was saying that liberalism is the untranscendable horizon of
right.
human history, and so and there were these like ideological fits that were thrown from the time of Hegel to 1989, but now people realize that this is the only way forward.
Hmm.
And so the question arises, why do we need massive standing armies, right? Why do we
Right.
need why do we need militaries that are armed to the hilt? Of course, why do we need cops that are armed to the hilt? Right? Why
Right.
do our cities need to be under armed occupation?
Hmm.
Et cetera. Those questions, of course, arise in from a bourgeois perspective. The people of the world are at peace with one another. The people of the world are in cooperative relations with one another. And all war is a crime committed by, power hungry elites,
Right.
by princes. Right.
Hmm.
That's the way that Kant would have understood it. Right. The way Thomas
Hmm.
Jefferson would have understood it.
Hmm.
And it's good to ask ourselves, why that can't happen. I mean, what I would say about base and superstructure is
Hmm.
simply that everybody knows that our freedom is economic, right? That our society is somehow economic in a conscious sense, right? That its freedom is bound up with free labor
Hmm.
in a fundamental way. That was integral to the bourgeois self-conception of modern freedom, right?
Hmm.
That it had to do with our collective relationship to nature, that it was material, right?
Hmm.
This was a material form of freedom that um, was taking place in nature,
Hmm.
right? That humanity was an event within nature, that society was an event within nature, that our freedom was subjective and objective, right? That labor was at the heart of it, as a collective phenomenon, right? And the crisis of our freedom is economic, right? The crisis of our freedom is, of course, going to express itself in the same way. It's a crisis of political economy, just as our freedom was a freedom of political economy. Capitalism is a crisis of political economy. I mean, what I would simply say about the German ideology is that, what most people get from that in terms of like modes of production, stages of history, all of that, it's just bourgeois, right? Adam Smith has that. Right? Everybody knows that, right? I can convince any student of that, that a society based on serf labor is going to have the thoughts of a society based on serf labor, right? In some sense, but more importantly, the point is that the society based on serf labor didn't think about serf labor at all. It didn't think about economics at all. It wasn't an economic form of society. Marx is in that text, he's simply trying to ask, the young Hegelians, why do you think that your thought stands outside of society?
Right.
Right. That's what he's trying to say, right? He's trying to say, like, look, even, a priest in ancient Babylon, as my old professor, Moish Bastone would say, he's a part of society. He keeps the calendar, right? He makes agriculture possible. He tells us when the festivals are to be celebrated and when we're to plant and when we're to reap, etc. In the same way, philosophers are a part of society today, and their ideology is expressive of the needs of this society. And they're insufficiently aware of that for Marx, right? They're insufficiently aware of the crisis that they're facing in trying to advance Hegelian philosophy. Right? Their attempts to advance Hegelian philosophy are actually falling below the threshold of Hegelian philosophy.
Right. Yeah.
Thereby becoming the German ideology.
Right.
To advance Hegel's philosophy is to recognize that the circumstances in which Hegel wrote no longer obtain exactly. Right. That bourgeois freedom is self-contradictory. And our consciousness, the consciousness of our social relations is, lags behind the potential of this society, because the consciousness that we have remains bourgeois, but the social being, the reality of our society points beyond bourgeois horizons altogether. I don't think any of that means that, that there's I mean, quite frankly, it's like a journalist's wisdom, right? Like, cui bono, right? Who do you follow the money, right? Like, you want to understand why people are trying to take down Joe Rogan's podcast? Well, follow the money, right? They're not, if this isn't really about COVID, it's about the profit, or it's about Neil Young's, songs.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. You're right. You can. Right. Yeah.
There's a simple and obvious truth to the fact that people tend not to think thoughts that are at odds with their interests. But of course, ideologically, at the level of convincing people, masses of people, of arguments about the direction of society as a whole, we're not going to get there by understanding, like, who does Jeff, what does Jeff Bezos invest in? like, he
Right. Okay.
paying the Washington Post to control our minds. No, this is not going to grasp it, right?
But I'm not asking like that kind of thing. I'm not saying, oh, who benefits from the conflict between China and the United States? Because from my perspective, it's clear that neither side benefits. From my perspective, it's clear that, in fact, what would be best for both countries is for there to not be a conflict and for there to be trade between the countries and for there to be mutual development and mutual interdependence. So the question for me is,
and for that,
why?
unfortunately, for that, socialism is possible. It's necessary,
Right.
For us globally,
but why? But why is it necessary? Is the question. Why can't we? What is happening with the mode of production and distribution and politics and all of it that is born out of this class relation? I mean, but the reason why I want to ask the question, why is China and why are China and the United States at odds with each other, and say it's not ideological, it's not because China is communist and the United States is the enemy of communism, which is some people on the left would say, but instead to say there's something about capitalist production and the economic political economy that comes out of it that sets the world at odds with itself. And you can trace how that works, and you can look at what it's doing to the money supply to both countries, and you can look at the labor shortages that's going on here, and the kind of labor struggles that are going on there, and you can look at the political economy of the situation without saying, oh, it's a conspiracy of one rich guy,
of course,
right?
Right, and the fundamental point is that capitalism sets workers against each other, right?
Right.
Ultimately, it's a problem for the working class.
Right.
It's
another way to ask the question is, why China and the United States? Why not Germany and the United States today? Why not? Why is it not? Because there are different power centers and economic blocks, and there's no real reason why Germany and the United States shouldn't be at odds in the same way that I know of right off the bat. Right, I'd have to look into and think about why not. And the first thing that comes to mind is because a political solution was put forward after World War II to limit the amount of conflict that would take place between European nations, so that those development that didn't develop, so that you had the euro, for instance, you had these economic and political solutions put in place to
right. So
create.
obviously, the United States recognized that the way to deal with the ambitions of Japan and Germany was to give them scope. Right. I mean, this is the great, if you will, achievement of the post-war period, is that the United States, it wasn't crushing the left or something like that. What it was fundamentally doing was putting the world back together, after immense war. And, it was remarkably successful in doing that. Now, why can't it continue to do that? Why can't it absorb, an American-led global order? Why can't it absorb and give scope to the ambitions of Russia and China? Well, I hope and think that it can at some level, right? In the sense of avoiding war, which I don't think I don't think people really have the stomach for, right? I do think that, what we have, the underlying question is, I'll tie it back into the imperialism question. The Frankfurt School's word for the imperialist or Bonapartist state is the authoritarian state. It's a way that they talk about. It's a way that they revive that category in light of the developments of the 1930s internationally. So they're trying to grasp through that category, fascism, FDR's America, and the Soviet Union. And of course, more famously, and a lot of leftists are preoccupied with this today, they also talk about the authoritarian personality as the kind of correlate to that.
Mm-hmm.
When you are confronting as an isolated, atomized worker,
Mm-hmm.
the reality of your dispensability, that you are superfluous, that
Mm-hmm.
there's always, more, others who are just as good as you
Mm-hmm.
to take your place. And you find your way in the world through political conformity, and your wages become indistinguishable from a kind of payoff for your conformity to the prevailing order.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, it's intolerable, right? It's psychologically intolerable.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have to wake up again and again with the understanding that the violence that you have to do to yourself
Mm-hmm.
is at some level itself unnecessary, right? We recognize that the world doesn't have to be this way, and that we live in the wake of the failure of freedom, of socialism in some important way. I think that is really what that is the fundamental social reality that Marxists have to talk about when we're talking about racism, or we're talking about the immigration question, or we're talking about anxiety towards the Chinese. Obviously we don't think of the Germans as having taken our jobs.
Right.
Because German prosperity and Japanese prosperity grew up after the war in a way, in a context where American
But in
society,
the 80s, we did think of the Japanese as taking away our jobs.
and you and I heard anti-Japanese racism in a way that nobody 25 years old has ever heard it, right?
Right.
The little, when we all saw, when we started to see little Honda Civics on the road, and you hear,
Right.
the older men say, goddamn rice burners, or
Yeah, right.
whatever, right?
Yeah.
So and that was in the wake of course, the post-war crisis, in the 1970s.
Mm.
Japanese cars appeared in the U.S. market, and electronic goods, in much more broadly coinciding with that. So I think that a lot of the hostility towards China, of course, it kind of partakes of that.
Yeah, I mean, the hostility towards China and the love of China both are emerging after the long recession. I mean, that is setting up the context for the conflict and the embrace. It's also, you can't ignore COVID. You can't ignore the personalities involved either. But I do think that there's something that I think that once you accept that the conflict has to do with the way capitalism splits nations and peoples against each other and the working class against each other, then that helps the left overcome its love of China as the future of socialism, which is that's been developing. Which is also,
of course, in China, we don't hear as much about it. I mean, you have to have Chinese leftist friends who know a great deal, and it's hard for them to know a great deal. It's easier for the whole world to know a great deal about America than it is for anyone to know a great deal about China.
right.
But of course, the Chinese Communist Party is, a capitalist party. It's, some level.
Right.
It doesn't mean that I don't know that, that I'm in favor of the overthrow of communism in China. Can't rehearse the issue of the gains of the Chinese Revolution. I can, and there, in some sense, they're still there. But there's massive labor discontent. They're trying to forcibly hold hundreds of millions of people on the land in China. They have internal passports. It's a serious issue. right?
Right.
And of course, they got, they're having to stoke, traditional Han Chinese racism against Chinese minorities. There's nothing to romanticize about the
Right.
condition anywhere, right? What we need is to build solidarity with actual socialists around the world, and
Yeah.
some of them may be found. That might involve splitting the Chinese Communist Party or something like that. It certainly means that we talk about internationalism amongst peoples and towards immigrants in this country, et cetera, that, we don't care about what the state does, but, we're not going to, we're not, I don't care what they do at some level at the border, but if somebody's working side by side with me,
Mhm.
the cops can't ask for their papers,
Right.
like,
Right.
of course, right? Of
Right.
course. And these are things that we have to, talk about, that solidarity exists at the level of society, not at the level of states,
Right.
you know.
Yeah. No, I think we've been talking for a little over an hour now. I feel like we got somewhere. We got a lot of places that were really interesting. I guess the last thing that I'll ask you to maybe talk about briefly is how you think that in this contemporary moment, the left might be able to begin to think its way towards out of this, or an act in such a way to get out of this stagnation, to get out of this regression. Um, because it seems to me that I see a lot of repetition, and as I get older, I feel like I get a deeper insight into the way the left is repeating itself, and have less and less to say as to like how to stop that from happening. Like, I have no idea how to take hold of the reins, or if it's even possible, or if there is a left, and so on. So, what would you say?
I mean, I guess I would simply say that, there's going to be there's going to be a lot involved in rebuilding a left,
Mm-hmm.
or something that could credibly claim to be the heir of the socialist left, that is even inconceivable to me. It may not take I don't know if it's going to take the form of a reconstituted socialist workers movement.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, just a second.
No
So
trouble.
I don't know what form that will take, and there will be a lot of skills involved that I don't have.
Mm-hmm.
But I can tell you this for sure, and that is that the problem is not the right. The problem is not the Republicans. The problem is not the Tories. The problem is on the left, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to address the fact that we do not have the answers, that it is that historically, that we're still in the wake
Mm-hmm.
of the collapse of our project, which was ultimately of our own doing, right? That ultimately the question of capitalism is a problem for workers, for socialists. The capitalists didn't create an obstacle that was insuperable. In fact, the way in which that happened, the right is always just the face of the left, right? It's actually in other words, the form that it takes is entirely conditioned by the left. The right has no project of its own.
Mm-hmm.
Never has. All that it ever does is to try to stabilize the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We have an ideological problem,
Mm-hmm.
which is rooted in, call it what you will. I call it Stalinism,
Mm-hmm.
the collapse of the left, the self-defeat of the left.
Mm.
The refusal to come to terms with our own history.
Mhm.
And this is why this is why people don't want to follow leftists. This is why we can't build anything but sects. Right? Society is right to not listen to the left.
Mhm.
Because these people are nuts that we're surrounded by. I mean, what lunatics they are.
Yeah.
And so to really begin to to stop lying to ourselves
Mhm.
and face the past. I think that because why? Because our theory of the past is our theory of the present.
Right.
And we're lying to ourselves if we think that presently we're in a position to take the rudder of history in our hands.
Mhm.
And
Right.
that, so I would say that there is a role for young people intellectually. That
Mhm.
we have an intellectual impasse. We have an ideological impasse. There may
Mhm.
be organizational and other impasses as well.
Mhm.
But until we address that ideological impasse, we're not going to be able to do anything in the real world, in politics, in history. And I think that, generations of young people have been told by the left that they are to substitute for a mass movement.
Yeah.
That they're to be fodder for some activist project that doesn't actually have mass support. So you get a bunch of unemployed kids in college to go out and act like they represent society as a whole and use them
Mhm.
in that way, and they are demoralized. It's a revolving door. They get demoralized, just like the young people were, just like the young people, and of course they set themselves up for this. But at the same time, I feel compassion for the millennials.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
They turn themselves, they're going around knocking on doors for Bernie,
Mhm.
and even bright young students of mine from elite colleges,
Mhm.
are telling themselves that they want to become plumbers so they concede the unions. They're going to follow a rank and file strategy. They're going to do anything in the world except to actually address the intellectual questions.
Right.
They're all of the and the kids that we know and the kids who are going to listen to this
Mhm.
are among the most privileged people on earth as
Mhm.
far as literacy is concerned,
Mhm.
and their ability to handle ideological questions. And
Mhm.
with that privilege, to sound a little Christian, comes responsibility.
You sound like Peter Parker's uncle.
Yeah.
But with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah. And the power is not to become a plumber,
Mhm.
or to, beat the pavement. The power is to actually try to think it through and to come to terms with the level, what I think you were talking about, the deep uncertainty.
Yeah. Right.
The fact that actually this isn't all clear,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
All that is clear is repetition.
Right. And every time we repeat, it seems to me that things get worse.
More degraded.
Yeah.
More degraded. Yep.
All right, listen, I'm gonna stop the recording there.